how do I start relationships with gospel intentionality? If relationships are kind of at the core, how do I start those relationships with intentionality? Aaron, what do you say about that?
3 words that help me that might be helpful for you are natural, normal, and cultural. We've got some great brothers and sisters in Christ that go to our church that they go door to door to share Christ. But for some of us, that might not feel natural or normal or cultural. And so that's what we think when we think of evangelism sometimes. But natural and normal things might be like maybe a neighborhood cookout. Maybe if you're grilling in the backyard and you see your neighbor, invite them over for a meal, maybe that night or another night. Or some cultural things like Super Bowl. We had our neighbors over last year and invited some staff members, and you were there, and you brought your kids there, and they were, sorry.
My kid threw up all over the place, so.
Sorry, bro, that was good. But while we were there at the house, the kids were in a different room, and one of the elementary school girls brought out the Awana app and started sharing Christ with our neighbor who didn't know Christ. So it was cultural to use the Super Bowl, but use it intentionally, invite our lost neighbors over, and then share Christ. So this is just 2 examples.
The back of the handout that we have, the 25 ways for missional living, all give kind of very specific, very practical ideas for us. Brian, what else would you add to that?
I would just say, look at your sphere of influence, the people that God has brought into your life, and just change your mindset and realize that is the mission field that God has given you, and to be faithful to share the gospel in that mission field. But then I would say, even as you treat them as your mission field, to be intentional about starting gospel conversations in that mission field that you have. But then also, I would say, looking at your schedule, just since being back in America, we are really busy and we guard our schedules really strongly. To be able to schedule your time to spend time with lost people, even using areas of influence or areas of interest that you might have, like sports or something else, use those instead of insulating yourself with a bunch of Christians, which is really easy to do in this culture. Use those as opportunities to connect with lost people who share a common interest with you.
Yeah, I would even jump in on that to say, talk about things that are natural. One of the spots you said don't assume. One of the spots I've always kind of found here at church is we kind of assume if somebody walks into our church, we assume a gospel understanding. And these are people, we think go out there and find somebody far out there, which is true where we want to go share the gospel. But a lot of times you may have somebody walk right into your Sunday school class this past Sunday morning, sat down in the class. They're interested in, they're at church. They're open to this. They sat in your class. You could have easily gone to lunch with them, or you're probably going to lunch today. You invite them to lunch, and the next thing you know, you're in a gospel conversation. We sometimes overlook maybe some of the lost people that are right here with us to try to think out there. And sometimes we even assume by people that look like Christians. They really aren't. They may have it on the appearance, but we need to engage them in some sort of gospel conversation.
Yeah, I think I've probably had, even outside of being a pastor, I've probably had more gospel conversations here at church, where normally, if I'm a Sunday school teacher, I just come to church. How do I know that the person sitting to my left or right or front or behind me, how do I know that they certainly understand and have embraced the gospel? They hear it. I don't think we need to make that assumption as well.
Yeah, and one thing I'll throw on that too is that I think sometimes we're afraid that if we're talking to somebody who's already like you might be a Christian, if I begin to ask you about what the gospel is, that somehow I'm going to offend you. But just the believers in the room, I want you to think for a second. If somebody asks you about the gospel, is that going to offend you? Or are you going to be thankful that somebody's sharing the gospel? To me, I'm always appreciative when somebody engages with me in the gospel. And so don't be afraid, even if you're not sure, to engage in a gospel conversation with somebody that may already be a believer. And maybe out of it, you had a great conversation. But that's a level that we shouldn't assume that oftentimes we do.